At 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11th, 1918, the guns stopped. For more than 4 years, artillery had shaken the earth from the North Sea to the mountains of the Balkans. Forests had become fields of broken trunks. Villages had disappeared beneath mud. Millions of men had learned to sleep beside rats, shattered timber, and the bodies of friends they could not safely retrieve. Then, at the appointed hour, the noise ended. The silence was so sudden that some soldiers did not trust it. They remained pressed against the walls of their trenches, waiting for the next shell. A few slowly raised their heads above the parapet. Others simply sat where they were, too exhausted to celebrate. Behind the lines, church bells began to ring. In Paris, London, and New York, crowds flooded the streets. Strangers embraced beneath waving flags. People shouted that the nightmare was over. But the world that had entered the war in 1914 no longer existed. For empires were collapsing. Millions were dead. Millions more were wounded, displaced, widowed, orphaned, or haunted by memories they could not explain. Borders would soon be redrawn by politicians seated around polished tables. New nations would appear. Old hatreds would deepen. And beneath the celebration, another catastrophe was already spreading through troop ships and crowded cities. A deadly influenza pandemic. The armistice ended the fighting. It did not end the consequences. To understand how Europe reached that final silence, we have to return to a summer morning 4 years earlier, when a young man stepped from a crowd in Sarajevo and fired 2 shots. Those shots did not create the rivalries that had divided Europe. They did not invent nationalism, imperial ambition, military fear, or the hunger for power. But they opened a door. And once that door was open, the most powerful nations on earth marched through it. In the summer of 1914, Europe appeared to be at the height of its confidence. Its cities glittered with electric lights. Railways connected capitals in hours rather than days. Telegraph cables carried messages across continents. Factories produced steel, chemicals, engines, and weapons on a scale no previous generation had imagined. Kings and emperors ruled over vast territories. Britain possessed the largest empire in the world. France controlled lands across Africa and Asia. Germany had become an industrial giant in the center of Europe. Austria-Hungary stretched across a complicated collection of peoples and languages. Russia ruled an enormous empire from Poland to the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire, weakened but still immense, controlled strategic lands joining Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The modern world seemed unstoppable. Yet beneath the surface, Europe was becoming more dangerous with every passing year. Germany feared encirclement by France and Russia. France had never forgotten the territories of Alsace and Lorraine, lost to Germany in 1871. Russia wanted influence in the Balkans and saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples. Austria-Hungary feared that nationalism would tear its empire apart. Britain watched Germany build a powerful navy and wondered whether the balance of power was slipping away. Nations formed alliances for protection. Germany stood beside Austria-Hungary. France allied with Russia. Britain moved closer to France and Russia, not through one simple promise of war, but through a web of agreements, military discussions, and shared fears. Each alliance was supposed to prevent conflict. Instead, it ensured that if war came, it would not remain local for long. Europe's armies also created plans based on speed. Generals believed that hesitation could be fatal. Germany feared a war on 2 fronts, against France in the west and Russia in the east. Its solution was to defeat France quickly, then turn against the slower-moving Russian army. France developed its own offensive plans. Russia prepared to mobilize millions of men. Railway timetables became part of military strategy. Once mobilization began, stopping it would be like trying to halt an avalanche. Then came the Balkans. For centuries, the region had been shaped by empires, religions, migrations, and rival national dreams. As Ottoman power declined in Europe, new states emerged and old ambitions expanded. Serbia wanted to unite South Slavic peoples, including many who lived inside Austria-Hungary. To leaders in Vienna, Serbian nationalism was not merely a political problem. It was an existential threat. At the center of this tension stood Bosnia and Herzegovina, occupied and later annexed by Austria-Hungary, but home to many Slavs who rejected Habsburg rule. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo with his wife, Sophie. It was a dangerous date. June 28th carried deep meaning for Serbian nationalists, connected to the medieval Battle of Kosovo. The Archduke's presence in Bosnia was seen by some as a provocation. A group of young conspirators waited along his route. They were linked to a revolutionary movement known as Young Bosnia, and had received assistance from elements connected to Serbian military intelligence. The first attack failed. A bomb was thrown at the Archduke's car, but it bounced away and exploded beneath another vehicle. Several people were injured. Franz Ferdinand continued to the city hall, angry but alive. It seemed the danger had passed. Then came one of history's most fatal turns. Later that morning, the Archduke decided to visit the wounded at a hospital. His driver was not properly informed of the changed route. When the car turned onto the wrong street, it stopped near a 19-year-old conspirator named Gavrilo Princip. Princip stepped forward. He fired twice. One bullet struck Sophie. The other struck Franz Ferdinand. Within minutes, both were dead. The assassination shocked Europe, but few people immediately believed it would cause a world war. Royal figures had been assassinated before. Governments had survived crises in Morocco and the Balkans. Diplomats had stepped back from disaster more than once. But this time, the decisions were different. Austria-Hungary wanted to crush Serbia. Its leaders believed that failure to act would make the empire appear weak and encourage more nationalist rebellion. Yet they feared Russia might intervene. So Vienna turned to Berlin. Germany offered Austria-Hungary what became known as the blank check, strong support, even if action against Serbia led to war with Russia. That promise changed everything. Austria-Hungary sent Serbia an ultimatum designed to be extremely difficult to accept. Serbia agreed to most demands, but rejected or qualified those that would have allowed Austro-Hungarian officials to operate inside Serbian territory. Vienna declared the response insufficient. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The machinery of alliance and mobilization began to move. Russia prepared to support Serbia and ordered mobilization. Germany demanded that Russia stop. Russia did not. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, allied with Russia, prepared for war. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. But the German plan required its armies to pass through neutral Belgium in order to strike France from the north. Belgium refused to allow German troops through. Germany invaded. Britain had strategic reasons to prevent Germany from dominating the coast opposite the English Channel. It also had obligations connected to Belgian neutrality. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. In less than a week, a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had drawn in Germany, Russia, France, Britain, and their empires. Across Europe, crowds gathered in public squares. Bands played. Flags waved. Many believed the war would be short. Soldiers marched away beneath flowers and cheers. Some feared the future, but others felt relief that years of tension had finally broken. Few understood what industrial war would mean. They imagined cavalry charges, bright uniforms, and decisive battles. They were about to meet machine guns, barbed wire, high-explosive shells, poison gas, submarines, and death organized by railways and factories. And by the time they understood, it would already be too late. The first weeks of war moved with terrifying speed. German armies crossed Belgium, attacking fortified cities and pushing west. Belgian resistance was stronger than expected, but it could not stop the advance. Towns burned. Civilians fled along roads crowded with carts, children, livestock, and whatever possessions families could carry. Reports of German violence spread quickly. Some stories were exaggerated by wartime propaganda, but many atrocities were real. Civilians were executed in reprisals. Homes were destroyed. The invasion of neutral Belgium became a powerful symbol used by the Allies to present the war as a struggle against aggression. Britain sent a small but professional expeditionary force to France. Compared with the enormous conscript armies of Europe, it was limited in size, but its soldiers were experienced and well-trained. At Mons, they met the advancing Germans. British rifle fire was so rapid that some German troops believed they faced machine guns. But the weight of the German advance forced the British and French into retreat. For days, Allied armies withdrew south beneath heat, exhaustion, and confusion. The German right wing swept toward Paris. The French government prepared to leave the capital. Some officials feared that war might be decided almost immediately. Then the German advance changed direction. Its armies had moved farther and faster than planned. Supply lines stretched behind them. Soldiers were exhausted. Commanders struggled to coordinate forces across enormous distances. German troops turned east of Paris, exposing their flank. The Allies saw an opportunity. In early September, French and British forces counterattacked along the Marne River. Paris taxis famously carried some troops toward the front, not enough to decide the battle, but enough to become a symbol of national determination. The fighting was immense. Armies collided across fields and villages. The German advance was stopped. German forces withdrew to more defensible ground north of the Aisne River. France had been saved from immediate defeat, but the victory did not end the war. Both sides tried to outflank each other to the north in a series of movements later called the Race to the Sea. They were not racing toward the coast in a single charge. They were repeatedly extending their lines, searching for an open flank. Soon, there was no open flank left. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, soldiers dug into the earth. At first, many trenches were shallow and temporary. Men believed they would soon advance. But as rifles, machine guns, and artillery punished anyone exposed in open ground, the trenches grew deeper and more elaborate. A new landscape appeared. The front line faced the enemy. Support and reserve trenches lay behind it. Communication trenches connected the system. Sandbags reinforced walls. Duckboards were placed over mud. Barbed wire spread across the ground. Underground shelters offered limited protection from shells. Between the opposing lines lay no man's land. Sometimes it was hundreds of yards wide. In other places, enemies were close enough to hear each other speak. The ground was torn by craters, tangled wire, broken equipment, and bodies. Life in the trenches was not a continuous battle. It was long periods of boredom and discomfort interrupted by moments of extreme terror. Men repaired defenses, carried ammunition, stood watch, removed water, wrote letters, and waited. Rats fed on food waste and corpses. Lice lived in uniforms. Rain turned trenches into canals. Cold froze boots and fingers. Feet became swollen and infected after days in wet conditions. Mud, smoke, sweat, chemicals, latrines, rotting sandbags, and the dead. Artillery was the greatest killer. Soldiers often never saw the weapon that killed them. A shell could arrive without warning, bury a shelter, destroy a body, or leave a man alive but psychologically shattered. The condition became known as shell shock. Some men trembled uncontrollably. Some lost speech or memory. Others appeared physically uninjured but could no longer move or respond. Military authorities struggled to understand whether this was injury, fear, weakness, or madness. For many soldiers, survival depended on small habits. Never stand where an officer had just stood. Never gather in obvious groups. Never show a light at night. Listen carefully to the sound of incoming shells. Learn which whistles meant gas and which meant attack. Yet despite the horror, soldiers also created routines, jokes, friendships, songs, and moments of humanity. The most famous came during Christmas 1914. Along parts of the Western Front, German and British soldiers began singing carols across no man's land. Small groups emerged cautiously from their trenches. They exchanged cigarettes, food, buttons, and photographs. Some buried the dead. In a few places, they may have kicked footballs between the lines. The truce was never universal, and fighting continued elsewhere. Commanders on both sides discouraged any repetition. They understood that it was harder to kill an enemy once he had become a human being with a face and a name. The temporary peace faded. The war continued, and soon, the trenches would become laboratories for new ways of killing. In April 1915, near the Belgian city of Ypres, German forces released chlorine gas from cylinders. A greenish cloud drifted toward Allied lines. Soldiers who had no proper protection began coughing, choking, and collapsing as the gas damaged their lungs. The attack opened a gap, but German commanders were not fully prepared to exploit it. The Allies improvised defenses, at first pressing damp cloths over their mouths. Later came gas masks and more advanced chemical agents, including phosgene and mustard gas. Gas was terrifying, but it caused fewer deaths than artillery. Its psychological power was enormous. A soldier could survive a bombardment and still panic at the sound of a gas alarm. The same industrial imagination that had created modern medicine, railways, and communications was now being turned toward mass destruction. But the Western Front was only one part of the war. Far to the east, armies moved across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Here, the distances were greater and trench systems less continuous. Russia mobilized more quickly than Germany expected and invaded East Prussia. German commanders Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff organized a counterattack. At Tannenberg in August 1914, German forces surrounded and destroyed much of one Russian army. The victory made Hindenburg and Ludendorff national heroes. Yet, Germany could not eliminate Russia from the war. The Russian Empire possessed enormous manpower, but its armies suffered from weak supply, poor coordination, and political problems. Austria-Hungary performed badly against both Serbia and Russia. Its multinational army contained brave soldiers, but command failures, language barriers, and outdated leadership weakened it. Repeated defeats made the empire increasingly dependent on Germany. Serbia resisted invasion in 1914, but victory came at terrible cost. Disease spread through the exhausted country. In 1915, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria launched a combined offensive. Serbian forces were overwhelmed and retreated through the mountains of Albania in winter. Thousands died from hunger, exposure, and attack before survivors were evacuated to the Greek island of Corfu. The war was consuming nations one by one. Then the Ottoman Empire entered the conflict. For centuries, European powers had competed over Ottoman territory and influence. By 1914, the empire had lost much of its European land, but it still controlled the Turkish Straits, Mesopotamia, Palestine, Syria, Arabia, and parts of the Caucasus. The Ottoman government aligned with Germany, partly because of fear of Russia and partly because of hopes of recovering lost power. In late 1914, Ottoman warships attacked Russian ports in the Black Sea. Russia, Britain, and France declared war. The Ottoman entry transformed the conflict. It threatened British routes, opened new fronts, and placed millions of people across the Middle East inside the war. The Allies now searched for a way to break the deadlock. Their eyes turned toward the Dardanelles. The plan seemed bold. If Allied warships could force their way through the Dardanelles, they might capture Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia through the Black Sea. In theory, it could transform the conflict. In reality, it became one of the war's most painful disasters. In February and March 1915, British and French ships bombarded Ottoman forts guarding the straits. Mines, mobile artillery, and determined resistance made progress difficult. On March 18th, a major naval attack ended with several Allied battleships sunk or disabled. The Allies decided that troops would have to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula and destroy the coastal defenses from land. On April 25th, soldiers came ashore at several beaches. British and French troops landed at Cape Helles. Australian and New Zealand forces landed farther north at what became known as Anzac Cove. The terrain was far worse than many planners had understood. Steep ridges rose above narrow beaches. Ravines cut through dry hills. Ottoman defenders held the heights. Among the Ottoman officers was Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. He recognized the danger and moved troops toward the landing areas without waiting for orders. His leadership helped stop the Allied advance. The invading soldiers dug in. Once again, the war became a siege of trenches, but now under intense heat, with limited water, clouds of flies, and disease. Men suffered from dysentery and exhaustion. In some places, Ottoman and Allied trenches were separated by only a few yards. Repeated attacks gained little ground. In August, the Allies launched new landings and assaults, hoping to break through. They failed. By the end of the year, commanders accepted that Gallipoli could not be won. The evacuation was carefully planned and carried out with remarkably few casualties. But the campaign had already cost more than 100,000 lives across both sides, with many more wounded or sick. Gallipoli became a defining national memory in Turkey, Australia, and New Zealand. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a rare and powerful victory. For the Allies, it was a warning that courage could not rescue a strategy built on poor intelligence and confused command. Yet even Gallipoli was only one piece of a much larger catastrophe. In the Caucasus, Ottoman and Russian armies fought through mountains and snow. In Mesopotamia, British imperial forces advanced from the Persian Gulf to protect oil interests and challenge Ottoman control. At Kut, a British and Indian force was surrounded and forced to surrender in 1916, one of Britain's most humiliating defeats. In Palestine and Arabia, the war gradually turned against the Ottomans. An Arab revolt, encouraged by Britain and led by Sharif Hussein's family, attacked Ottoman railways and positions. British officers, including T.E. Lawrence, later became famous for their role, though popular legend often exaggerated the importance of individual outsiders compared with Arab leaders and fighters. The war in the Ottoman lands also brought one of its darkest crimes. In 1915, Ottoman authorities began the mass deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia. Armenian men were disarmed and murdered. Women, children, and the elderly were forced onto marches toward the Syrian desert. Many were killed outright. Others died from starvation, disease, abuse, and exposure. Historians widely recognize these events as genocide. Estimates vary, but around 1 million or more Armenians died. Assyrian and Greek Christian communities also suffered mass violence, displacement, and death during this period. The Armenian genocide was not an accidental side effect of battle. It was organized persecution carried out under cover of war. History remembers armies and borders, but war often gives governments the darkness they need to attack their own people. By 1916, the conflict had become a contest of endurance. Each side searched for the blow that would finally break the other. Germany chose Verdun. The fortified city held enormous symbolic importance for France. German commander Erich von Falkenhayn later claimed his intention was to force France into a battle where it would bleed to death. Historians still debate how clearly that exact goal existed from the beginning, but the result was exactly that kind of struggle. On February 21, 1916, German artillery opened fire. The bombardment was unlike anything soldiers had experienced. Shells destroyed trenches, forests, and fortifications. German troops advanced through smoke and broken ground. Fort Douaumont, one of the strongest positions around Verdun, fell early with surprisingly little resistance. France faced a choice. It could withdraw and preserve its army, or defend a place that had become a symbol of national survival. It chose to defend. General Philippe Pétain organized the French response. Troops and supplies moved along a single vital road later called the Sacred Way. Units rotated through the battle, meaning that a large part of the French army experienced Verdun. For months, men fought over forts, hills, trenches, and ruins. Positions changed hands repeatedly. Names such as Douaumont, Vaux, and Mortem became symbols of horror. The landscape itself seemed to die. Villages were erased. Soil was mixed with metal, bone, and unexploded shells. Soldiers entered a world where normal measures of time and distance had lost meaning. The French declared, "They shall not pass." But survival came at an unbearable price. To relieve pressure on Verdun, Britain and France prepared a major offensive along the Somme River. The battle was planned before Verdun, but now it carried even greater urgency. British forces would take a larger role because the French army was consumed elsewhere. For a week, Allied artillery bombarded German lines. Commanders hoped the shells would destroy barbed wire, crush trenches, and kill defenders. Many soldiers were told that little resistance would remain. At 7:30 in the morning on July 1, 1916, whistles blew. British troops climbed out of their trenches and began moving across no man's land. In many sectors, the bombardment had failed. German soldiers had survived in deep shelters. The wire remained intact. Machine gunners emerged as the artillery lifted. They opened fire. By the end of the first day, the British Army had suffered around 57,000 casualties, including more than 19,000 dead. It was the bloodiest day in its history. Entire communities had joined together in volunteer units, known as PALS battalions. Men from the same streets, factories, sports clubs, and workplaces fought side by side. When those battalions were destroyed, grief returned to the same towns all at once. The battle did not end on the first day. It continued for months. The Allies gained ground slowly. Germany suffered heavily too. In September, Britain introduced a new weapon, the tank. The first tanks were slow, unreliable, hot, and mechanically fragile. Many broke down. They did not decide the battle, but their appearance hinted at a future in which armor, engines, and mobility might restore movement to the battlefield. When the Somme offensive ended in November, the Allies had advanced only a few miles. Total casualties on all sides exceeded 1 million. Verdun and the Somme became symbols of everything people later believed about the First World War: enormous sacrifice, limited gains, and commanders sending men against impossible defenses. That image contains truth, but the reality was more complicated. Generals were not all indifferent fools, and armies were learning. Artillery coordination improved. Small unit tactics changed. Aircraft provided reconnaissance. Communications became more sophisticated. But every lesson was purchased with lives, and the war still showed no sign of ending. The struggle extended far beyond the battlefields. At sea, Britain used its powerful navy to blockade Germany, restricting food, fertilizer, fuel, and raw materials. The blockade tightened slowly, but its effects became severe. German civilians faced shortages, malnutrition, and a winter remembered as the turnip winter because potatoes and other basic foods had become scarce. Germany answered with submarines. U-boats hunted merchant vessels carrying supplies to Britain. A submarine could strike without warning, but international rules traditionally required crews to protect civilians before sinking commercial ships. That was difficult when a surfaced submarine could itself be attacked. In May 1915, the British passenger liner Lusitania was torpedoed off Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including more than 100 Americans. Germany argued that the ship was carrying war materials, which it was, but the civilian deaths caused outrage. For a time, Germany limited submarine operations to avoid provoking the United States. The United States had declared neutrality in 1914. President Woodrow Wilson said Americans should be impartial in thought as well as action. But true neutrality became increasingly difficult. American banks and businesses traded heavily with the Allies. British control of the seas limited commerce with Germany. News of German actions in Belgium shaped public opinion. Still, many Americans wanted no part in Europe's war. The conflict was already global without them. Soldiers came from across the French and British empires. Indians, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, West Indians, North Africans, West Africans, and many others. They fought in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Their service exposed the contradiction at the heart of imperial propaganda. European powers claimed to fight for civilization and freedom while ruling millions of people who had little political freedom of their own. On the Western Front, colonial soldiers endured not only enemy fire but racism from the societies they defended. Some would return home asking why sacrifice for an empire did not bring equal rights. The war also transformed civilian life. Governments controlled industries, prices, transport, and information on an unprecedented scale. Propaganda encouraged enlistment, sacrifice, and hatred of the enemy. Newspapers were censored. Posters turned war into simple images of duty and danger. Women entered jobs previously dominated by men. They worked in munitions factories, transport, agriculture, offices, and hospitals. Munitions workers handled dangerous chemicals that could stain their skin yellow and damage their health. Nurses treated men with wounds that medicine had never faced on such a scale. Women had worked before the war, often in difficult and poorly paid labor. But the conflict made their contribution impossible to ignore. In several countries, the war accelerated the movement toward women's voting rights, though equality remained distant. Families lived between hope and dread. Letters from the front were treasured. A delayed message could cause panic. A telegram arriving at the door could destroy a household in seconds. The official language of death was often brief. A son, husband, father, or brother had been killed in action. Sometimes there was no body to bury. The oceans and skies developed their own legends, but the reality was usually less romantic than the stories told afterward. In May 1916, the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet met in the North Sea at the Battle of Jutland. It was the largest naval clash of the war. British battlecruisers suffered devastating explosions, and Germany inflicted heavier immediate losses. Yet the German fleet returned to port, while Britain maintained control of the sea and continued the blockade. Both governments claimed victory. Strategically, little changed. Germany could win a battle and still remain trapped behind British naval power. Above the trenches, aircraft had begun the war as fragile observation machines. Pilots watched enemy movements and reported artillery positions. At first, crews fired pistols and rifles at one another in the air. Then engineers synchronized machine guns to fire through spinning propellers. The sky became a battlefield. Fighter pilots were presented as modern knights. Newspapers celebrated aces such as Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and turned individual combat into heroic legend. But the life expectancy of new pilots could be frighteningly short. Aircraft caught fire easily. Parachutes were not routinely provided to many pilots. A small mechanical failure could be as deadly as enemy fire. Observation balloons hung above the lines, protected by anti-aircraft guns and fighters. Crews watched the enemy from baskets suspended beneath enormous gas-filled shapes. To attack, one meant flying directly into concentrated defenses. Bombing also reached civilians. German Zeppelins and later heavy aircraft attacked British cities. The raids killed far fewer people than later bombing campaigns would, but they changed the psychology of war. The front was no longer somewhere far away. Families could look into the night sky and hear engines carrying death toward their homes. In Africa, Allied forces attacked German colonies. Fighting occurred across deserts, forests, and vast distances where disease often killed more soldiers than bullets. In German East Africa, Commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck conducted a long campaign that tied down larger Allied forces. His army depended heavily on African soldiers known as askaris and on enormous numbers of porters, many of whom suffered and died under brutal conditions. The global scale of the war is often hidden by images of European trenches. Battles were fought in Africa, the Middle East, the Pacific, and on distant seas. Japanese forces captured German possessions in China and the Pacific. Indian soldiers fought in France, Mesopotamia, East Africa, and Gallipoli. Chinese laborers worked behind Allied lines, repairing roads, unloading ships, and recovering bodies. Millions served without receiving equal recognition. The war's demands reached deep into daily life. Farmers were ordered to produce more food while losing sons and workers to the army. Children collected materials for recycling. Families stood in ration lines. Governments encouraged civilians to save fuel, avoid waste, and accept shortages as patriotic sacrifice. Every major power borrowed enormous sums of money. War bonds transformed citizens into financial participants in the conflict. Posters promised that buying a bond supported the soldier at the front. The longer the war continued, the more national economies became dependent on total victory simply to justify the cost. There was also resistance. Socialists, pacifists, religious objectors, and exhausted workers questioned the slaughter. Some refused military service. Some were imprisoned. In factories, strikes erupted over wages and food. Governments feared not only enemy armies, but unrest at home. The emotional distance between front and home could be painful. Newspapers spoke of progress, courage, and enemy losses. Soldiers knew how little those words resembled the mud around them. Letters were censored, and many men hid the worst details from their families. They wrote about weather, food, and friends. They did not write that a body had been built into the trench wall because there was nowhere else to place it. They did not write that an officer had ordered another attack across ground everyone knew was covered by machine guns. They did not write that they had stopped believing they would survive. And at home, families often protected the soldiers in return. They avoided writing about unpaid bills, illness, grief, or the fear that the next knock on the door would bring official news. Both sides lived through carefully edited versions of the truth. But by 1917, the truth could no longer be hidden. By 1917, exhaustion was spreading through every major power. France launched a large offensive under General Robert Nivelle, who promised a decisive breakthrough. Instead, the attack failed at enormous cost. Parts of the French army mutinied. The soldiers did not generally abandon the defense of France. Many refused further suicidal attacks while remaining willing to hold their trenches. Pétain restored discipline through a mixture of punishment and reform. Some mutineers were executed, but conditions also improved. Leave became more regular, and large offensives were reduced. Britain continued attacking in Flanders. The Third Battle of Ypres, commonly known as Passchendaele, began in the summer of 1917. Heavy shelling destroyed drainage systems. Rain transformed the battlefield into a sea of mud. Men, horses, guns, and vehicles sank into shell holes filled with water. Wounded soldiers sometimes drowned before rescuers could reach them. The ruined village of Passchendaele was eventually captured, but the name became another symbol of suffering for limited gain. Yet 1917 also brought changes that would decide the war. Russia was collapsing. Years of defeat, shortages, inflation, and political failure had destroyed confidence in Tsar Nicholas II. In March 1917, according to the modern calendar, strikes and demonstrations erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers ordered to suppress the crowds began joining them. The Tsar abdicated. A provisional government took power, but it made a fatal choice. It continued the war. Russian soldiers were exhausted. Peasants wanted land. Workers demanded food and power. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promised peace, land, and bread. In November 1917, they seized power. The new revolutionary government sought an end to fighting. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and its allies, surrendering vast territories. Germany had escaped the two-front war, but another enemy had entered. In early 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Its leaders knew this could bring the United States into the conflict, but they believed submarines could starve Britain into surrender before American power arrived. Then British intelligence revealed the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal offering support for Mexico to recover territory lost to the United States if Mexico joined a war against America. The proposal was unrealistic, but its publication caused anger. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. America was not immediately ready to send a massive army. Men had to be recruited, trained, equipped, and transported across an ocean patrolled by submarines. But American entry changed the strategic balance. The Allies now knew that fresh manpower, money, food, and industrial power were coming. Germany knew time was running out. In the spring of 1918, German leaders gambled everything on one final offensive. With divisions transferred from the former Russian front, German forces attacked in the west before American troops could arrive in overwhelming numbers. On March 21st, Operation Michael began with a massive bombardment. German stormtroopers used new infiltration tactics. Instead of attacking every strongpoint, they moved around resistance, struck command posts, and pushed deep into Allied positions. The front broke open. British forces retreated. German troops advanced farther than they had since 1914. Paris was again threatened, and long-range guns began firing shells toward the city. For a moment, Germany appeared close to victory. But the offensive carried a hidden weakness. The Germans captured devastated ground, not the major strategic targets they needed. Their best assault troops suffered heavy losses. Supply systems could not keep pace. Hungry soldiers stopped to seize Allied food stores. Horses and men were exhausted. The advance slowed. Germany launched additional offensives, but each gained less and cost more. Meanwhile, American soldiers were arriving in increasing numbers. At Below Wood, St. Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne, American forces entered major combat. They were inexperienced and often suffered heavily, but their presence proved that Germany's window was closing. The Allies had also improved. Under a more unified command led by French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, they combined infantry, artillery, aircraft, and tanks more effectively. On August 8, 1918, at Amiens, Allied forces attacked with surprise and coordination. Ludendorff later called it the Black Day of the German army. German soldiers began surrendering in greater numbers. Units were under strength. Civilians were hungry. The blockade continued. Germany's allies were breaking apart. Bulgaria sought an armistice. Ottoman resistance collapsed after defeats in Palestine and Syria. Austria-Hungary disintegrated as national groups declared independence. Inside Germany, sailors mutinied rather than take part in what they believed would be a final, pointless naval battle. Workers' and soldiers' councils appeared. Political revolution spread. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. Germany became a republic. Its representatives entered a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne to receive Allied terms. They had little power to negotiate. The alternative was invasion and continued blockade. The armistice was signed early on November 11th. It would take effect at 11 o'clock. Even after the agreement was signed, fighting continued during the final hours. Some commanders wanted to seize ground. Some soldiers died only minutes before the ceasefire. Then the clocks reached 11. The guns stopped. More than 16 million soldiers and civilians had died from direct wartime causes, though exact totals vary. Tens of millions had been wounded. Entire regions were shattered. The numbers were so large that they can hide the individuals inside them. A number cannot show a mother reading her final letter from a son. It cannot show a blinded soldier learning to cross a room. It cannot show refugees returning to a village that no longer existed. It cannot show the silence at a family table where one chair would always remain empty. The survivors returned to a changed world. Some were welcomed by cheering crowds. Others came home disabled, unemployed, or psychologically traumatized. Men who had learned to survive bombardments struggled with ordinary life. Governments celebrated heroes, but often failed to care for them. The dead were buried in vast military cemeteries. Thousands remained unidentified. The words, "known unto God," appeared on stones where a name should have been. In 1919, the victorious powers gathered at Paris to shape the peace. Woodrow Wilson arrived with a vision of national self-determination and a League of Nations that might prevent another war. But the peace conference was driven by competing interests. France wanted security against Germany. Britain wanted stability while protecting its empire. Italy demanded promised territory. Japan sought recognition of its gains and status. Smaller nations and colonized peoples presented claims that were often ignored. Germany was excluded from the main negotiations. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept responsibility for losses caused by the war, surrender territory, limit its military, and pay reparations. The treaty did not simply reduce Germany to helplessness, but it created deep resentment and became a powerful political weapon for extremists. The map of Europe changed dramatically. Poland returned. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created. Austria and Hungary became separate states. The Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires were gone or transformed. But self-determination was applied unevenly. In the Middle East, Britain and France took control of former Ottoman territories through mandates. Wartime promises made to Arabs, Zionists, and imperial partners overlapped and conflicted. Borders were drawn in ways that would shape future struggles. Across Asia and Africa, people who had supported the Allied war effort hoped for greater freedom. Many discovered that European leaders did not intend to end colonial rule. The peace had ended one war. It had not resolved the forces that caused it. In Germany, defeat combined with revolution, economic crisis, political violence, and the myth that the army had been betrayed from within. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi movement would later exploit those lies, the anger surrounding Versailles, and fear of communism. The First World War did not make the Second World War inevitable. Human choices still mattered, but it created the conditions in which another catastrophe became possible. It also changed warfare forever. Aircraft had begun as tools of observation and became fighters and bombers. Tanks evolved from unreliable machines into symbols of mobile war. Submarines demonstrated the vulnerability of global trade. Governments learned to mobilize entire economies and populations. The boundary between soldier and civilian had weakened. The war changed politics, art, medicine, technology, and memory. It helped spread revolution. It weakened old aristocracies. It accelerated movements for independence and voting rights. It left unexploded shells buried beneath European fields for generations. And it changed language itself. Before 1914, war was often described through ideas of honor, glory, and adventure. After Verdun, the Somme, Gallipoli, and Passchendaele, those words sounded different. The soldiers who marched away in 1914 did not know they were entering the end of an age. They believed they were defending nations, families, empires, or ideals. Some went willingly. Some were forced. Some were excited. Some were terrified. Most believed they would return soon. Instead, they entered a conflict that turned Europe's greatest achievements against its own people. Science made artillery more accurate. Industry produced ammunition by the millions. Railways delivered men to the front. Bureaucracies counted bodies and requested replacements. This was not an ancient eruption of mindless violence. It was modern society using all of its organization, education, technology, and discipline to destroy itself. And that may be the most disturbing truth of the First World War. The disaster was not caused by one assassination alone. It was created by fear, ambition, nationalism, imperial rivalry, rigid plans, and leaders who repeatedly believed that the next escalation would protect them. Each decision appeared limited. Support an ally. Mobilize an army. Cross a border. Launch one offensive. Refuse one compromise. But those decisions connected like links in a chain. By the time millions understood where the chain was leading, they were already trapped inside it. At 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918, the silence finally came. For those who survived, it must have felt impossible. But history remembers what followed. The empires fell. The treaties were signed. The maps were redrawn. The monuments were built. And beneath them lay a warning that the world did not fully obey. Civilization is not protected by its wealth, its machines, or its confidence. Sometimes those very things make destruction easier. The First World War began with 2 bullets in Sarajevo. It ended with a generation buried across continents. And the world that emerged from the trenches would spend the rest of the century living with the consequences.